Hey World Lit folks, I'm excited about this video. I've been saying from the beginning that Cry the Beloved Country is maybe my favorite book of the class, one of my favorite books, and hopefully with all the things that I've been telling you about the book's structure, hopefully you've been kind of looking in anticipation at book 3. I think that's what I was hoping to do, is to see how the structures that we've been talking about really lead us to book 3. So what I usually do in the past, just because I love this book, and especially I just love the ending and the entirety of book 3, I usually, because I am asking you guys to do some like TED Talks, I usually kind of say that this is like my TED Talk that I'm modeling to you guys, and kind of taking that approach in talking about like why it's why I love this book. But to do that, I sort of break down book 3 a little bit. So I hope you'll watch this whole thing. I get so excited about this stuff. I think there's just so much wisdom and so much depth in the ending of this book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down into 4 different lessons. You'll see a lot of TED Talks do that, have a very purposeful structure. So that's the structure I'm going to take. Is I'm going to break it into 4 different lessons, all of which I think are powerful. So let's dig into it real quick. At the lead up to book 3, like I've said a lot, Alan Paton is painting this world that is destroyed, a paradise that's been lost. Even the land itself is described as being sick. The country is described as crying, and he says that the tribe, the house, and the man, so at every level, this world that he lives in, there is brokenness, there is destruction, there is hate, there is division, and we follow these 2 men, in this completely racially divided world. These 2 men should be enemies, and not only that, one of them, his son, kills the other one's son. So on all counts, they should be enemies. We could say they're destined to be enemies. But we follow them both along this very, we could say, universal journey from their known world down into chaos, into the unknown, into the crazy world of Johannesburg. And then, like all structures like this, we think about the hero's journey. What we're hoping for, what we're looking for, is a rebirth, redemption, something new, right? And the something new, it always comes as a result of going down into darkness, into the abyss, into evil. So it's this whole idea of resurrection, right? Like life coming out of death. So when we arrive at book 3, I think that's what should be on our mind. Is any life going to come out of all this destruction and death? Will there be any redemption for these broken people in this broken world? And right off the bat, in book 3, Stephen reflects. There is something new in this valley. Some spirit, some life. So we see some anticipation even at the beginning of book 3. Something new is here. Something new is coming. I think a big initial first part of this is kind of represented in these 2 brand new characters. It's sort of strange that a book would introduce brand new characters at the end of the book, but we get 2 new characters, and I'm not going to talk in too much detail about them because I actually might mention them in your graduation speech. But I think both the agricultural demonstrator, so this young black man who has this like new set of skills to teach the farmers, whenever Stephen meets him, he says, "Oh, you are an angel from God," right? So he sees a lot of hope in him. But I think another interesting character to think about is this young white boy who we learn is the son of Arthur. Which again, if you think about this in reality, like, Stephen's son killed this dude's dad, this little kid's dad, they should not have a connection, but we see this connection. We see this boy display this sort of innocence and life. And not only does Stephen call this little boy the same word that he called the agricultural demonstrator, he calls him an angel. He says he sees a brightness in him, which is interesting to think about because whenever Stephen and Jarvis had their conversation about that first awkward conversation about their sons, realizing who the other one is, Stephen says, "Oh, there was a brightness in your boy," because he had observed him and he had seen Arthur as a young kid. So we could even say, I would argue, that this little white boy is sort of like Arthur resurrected. I think there's totally, we could say, some Christ symbolism going on here, that like Arthur was killed by the people he was trying to save, and now we see sort of his spirit like resurrected and reborn in his son. And you know, we see this repeated term, like there's a brightness in this boy. So I could talk a lot more about them, but maybe as like a first lesson we could say is, you know, hope for change is often found in unexpected, unanticipated places. You know, Stephen's, what he was hoping for, he doesn't really know what he's hoping for, but the introduction of these two characters is just very unexpected, and I think really cool to think about what they represent. The second, I think, part of this, the second lesson, and I think these first two lessons are really sort of like more like heart things. When I had you guys read the end of book 1, I had you guys really do some digging into sort of the inner struggles, what I call the internal damage of Stephen. We see him doubting the goodness of God. We see him wondering, you know, who knows the secret of this earthly pilgrimage, really, like who knows basically like why there is so much suffering in this world. That's the big question that I see being explored here. So then we get to book 3, and I think, again, if we see like the country and the suffering land as being symbolic, I feel like these like prayers for rain are really like a symbolic, like asking for cleansing. You know, we think about the symbolic image of baptism, right? And then as the rain clouds start to build, we see this man ask Stephen, you know, this is like a young man, a part of Stephen's church, asking him, like, this world is full of trouble. And he said, yeah, you believe? Basically, like, he's asking, like, does he still believe in God? Does he still believe in goodness and hope? And this is what he says. I think it's really profound. You know, he recognizes that, like, pain and suffering, they are a secret. Like, we can never understand these things. But I love the line, kindness and love can pay for pain and suffering. And then there's I think the beautiful idea of Christ not taking away the suffering of his people completely, but teaching us how to like endure it. So if I were to boil all this down into a lesson, you know, we could see Stephen's kind of internal journey as sort of like a figuring out what his response to like evil and suffering is going to be. Sometimes he is in despair. Sometimes he just kind of numbs himself. Sometimes he just wants to escape and run away from it. And I think that's so powerful because that's so real, right? I think all of us, we could even think about our responses today during like in today's world during quarantine. Like all of us have the tendency to do all these things, to give into despair, to give into grief, to numb ourselves and not feel anything. But I think what Stephen's epiphanies tell us, I think, the lesson is that our best response to evil and suffering is to face it, not to ignore it, to face it, and ultimately to take action in working and making this world a better place, and we could say overcoming suffering. Not that we can like fully overcome the world's evil, but that the most important thing is our response. And I think his insistence on goodness, kindness, love in the face of suffering. I think it sounds simple and it might sound cliche, but I think it's not. I think it's powerful, and I think making that choice when you're in a position like his, in the depth of despair and brokenness and hurt, to still choose to make that decision, I think is a beautiful lesson. All right, so we could say maybe these first two lessons are more like heart internal lessons. I love it though, because he does get practical. You know, obviously he can't say everything how to fix the whole world, you know, his whole country. But from this, you know, I mentioned that like the prayers for rain, the gathering rain clouds is this building symbol of like healing, baptism, coming to heal this parched, dry land. And I just love the build up to this and just like the release of like the rain at last. And I think it's beautiful that I think one of the most iconic moments of the whole story is when Stephen and Jarvis are sitting together and watching these rain clouds gather. And I think it's very purposeful that we see this image of baptism, of healing, of rebirth, sort of connecting to what I think it's really the most famous part of the plot of this book. This very powerful act of Jarvis of surprising Stephen of this with this gift of a new church. And I think it's less about the church, even though I think that's important. To me, it's more of this act of, it reminds me of the word grace. It's this situation where this man has maybe every reason to hate this other man. Society is certainly telling him to hate him. But not only do we see forgiveness and mercy, but we see this like extravagant act of grace, this beautiful act of love, in the face of expectation, in the face of suffering and hardship, and you know this sense of hope and redemption and peace washes over Stephen. And it's not, you know, right here it says, it did not happen as men deem such things to happen. Meaning that like the redemption that came didn't happen in a way that he was expecting. But it's like so beautiful and redemptive and healing. You know, I would say it's God-like in its beauty. So I think for me, it's just this very practical reminder that like forgiveness and grace, and you know, we can put like a spiritual spin on that if we want to, but also like these are not purely spiritual things. These are like human actions that we can do. They have so much power to heal the world, not only for the people that are forgiven, but for the people giving the forgiveness. And something cool I'll just mention about this real quick is that when you look at the history of South Africa and the work of Nelson Mandela, if you aren't familiar with what Nelson Mandela did as president once he came out of house arrest and eventually became president once apartheid fell, one of the most famous things he did was start this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was this it's really unprecedented. It was like this month, maybe years long, televised, basically a courtroom proceedings being televised. It was mostly white people coming to confess and ask forgiveness of like specific acts of evil and hate they did to black people. Sometimes it was like police officers who had like unjustly killed young like black men coming to ask for forgiveness from like the young man's mother. So just this crazy, vulnerable, painful moments, and it was televised. And the idea was that, let me show a little clip from this video. This is a really famous guy, probably the other very famous figure of kind of work of South Africa working through apartheid. He was like an archbishop in the Anglican Church, which is the same church that Stephen in this book is supposed to be from. His name is Desmond Tutu. Maybe you've heard of him. But just listen to this real quick.
The raison d'etre for this commission is opening wounds, cleansing them so that they do not fester, and saying we have dealt with our past as effectively as we could. We have not denied it. We have looked the beast in the eye.
I think we all learned a great deal during the commission about forgiveness, about how you reach it, about the fact that most people don't reach it, about the fact that even if you do it once, you actually have to, in a way, keep on and on forgiving if you want to be healed and be sane after terrible suffering.
One of the things that the Archbishop made very clear was the fact that forgiveness is not easy. And he would often say that you are in love with your wife. You do something wrong, and even in the privacy of your bedroom, it is hard to say, I'm sorry. And here we are asking people publicly, in the glare of television cameras, to say sorry for a very horrendous deed. And the Archbishop was just trying to show that forgiveness is not cheap.
Yeah, I think beautiful, right? And then for our last lesson, it's pretty straightforward, but I think it's just a cool, practical way to end. Another really cool part of book 3 is when Stephen, towards the end, he is like reflecting on his relationship with his brother. And, you know, we see lots of differences between the approaches of Stephen and his brother John. And he kind of sees some of the tendencies, some of like the political passion of John in Mr. I forget his name, Letsitsi, the agricultural demonstrator. We see like a lot, like some political passion, some interest to really take to politics as like the means of change. And Stephen kind of stops him, and he says, you know, I cannot stop you from thinking your thoughts. It is good that a young man has such deep thoughts, but hate no man and desire power over no man. For I have a friend, he's talking about his brother, that taught me that power corrupts. So if maybe we could say for our last lesson, and I think it's so relevant to so many of the books we read. You know, at the beginning of this book, I said that like Cry the Beloved Country really does shed some powerful light and provide some powerful answers to a lot of the questions that we've been discussing and the books that we read, that we've read. So we could say that like it's all about this personal struggle against hate and against greed. You know, if you think about the books we've read, the pain and the suffering in so many of them, we've read some pretty dark stuff in our books, right? But, you know, the world is a messy place. The world is a dark place sometimes. I think at the end of the day, not all evil, but so much evil comes down to like morality and choosing to love instead of hate, and to put your own self-interest and your own greed aside in the light of, you know, generosity and a generous spirit. So that's when the book ends, and even the last scene, it's kind of complicated. We see Stephen climbing this mountain, which even that is kind of like a contrasting symbol. People say that Stephen climbing the mountain at the end is supposed to be similar. It's supposed to be the similar idea to Abraham climbing the mountain to like sacrifice his son Isaac, if you know that story from the Old Testament. So it's this complicated image of he's facing this like dark, evil thing of his son being executed, right? But then also the image of climbing a mountain is also this image of like being closer to God and reaching towards hope and reaching towards a better future. And, you know, I think it's a good way for this book to end because it is complicated, right? The redemption that Stephen was hoping for, which was his son not getting executed, it doesn't happen. His son gets executed. But still, because of all this other stuff that happened in book 3, he is able to see the dawn coming as a hopeful thing, and he's able to cling into hope for a better world and for goodness to eventually win out. We could see, and he has faith that at the end of the day, redemption is going to come. So I don't know about you, but I think the whole arc of book 3 is just so beautiful, so powerful, and I hope these lessons left an impression on you.